Let me ask you something. Have you ever walked away from an argument, replaying it in your head, thinking, I had the facts, I had the logic, so how did I lose? You knew you were right, you had evidence, you explained it clearly, and yet, somehow, you were the one who looked defensive, emotional, uncertain. Or maybe it's been the opposite. Maybe you knew, deep down, you weren't completely right. Maybe your argument had holes in it. But you still felt that urge to win, not because the truth mattered more, but because losing felt like shrinking. Here's the uncomfortable reality nobody talks about. Arguments are rarely about facts. They're about perception. They're about emotional control. They're about who holds the psychological high ground. The person who wins isn't always the one with better logic. It's the one who controls the frame, the one who manages tone, the one who stays composed while the other person spirals. And once you understand that, everything changes. Because this isn't about learning how to manipulate people. It's about understanding the game that's already being played around you. At work, in relationships, in family conversations, even online. Some people instinctively know how to steer arguments in their favor. They redirect pressure. They ask the right questions. They stay calm when others get reactive. And whether they're right or wrong, they walk away looking stronger. Today, you're going to learn exactly how that works. Not so you can deceive people, but so you never get outmaneuvered again. Because once you understand the psychology behind arguments, you stop fighting harder and you start fighting smarter. Let's get into it. First, understand this. Most arguments are not about truth. They're about status. They're about ego. They're about control. They're about emotional dominance. When two people argue, it may sound like a debate about facts, but underneath it, it's a negotiation of power. Who has the upper hand? Who looks more confident? Who appears more certain? That's what people are subconsciously tracking, because in social dynamics, humans don't just respond to information, they respond to signals. Tone, body language, emotional stability, certainty. The person who stays calm while the other gets reactive immediately appears stronger. The person who controls what the argument is about controls the battlefield. And the person who manages perception wins, even if they're wrong, because perception often beats accuracy. If you look confident, you're assumed to be competent. If you look composed, you're assumed to be correct. That's not always fair, but it's real. And once you understand that arguments are about power, not just proof, you stop trying to prove yourself and you start positioning yourself. That's where the shift begins. The first rule of winning any argument is simple: control the frame. Whoever defines what the conversation is really about wins, because the frame determines the battlefield. And most people don't even realize a battlefield has been chosen. Let's say someone tells you, you never listen. Most people instantly defend. That's not true. I do listen. Give me one example. Now you're trapped. You're arguing inside their frame, trying to prove you're not guilty. Instead, you reframe. Calmly say, I think what you're really upset about is feeling unheard. Notice what just happened. The conversation shifted. It's no longer about whether you technically listen. It's about how they feel. And emotions are harder to debate than facts. When you reframe, you're not rejecting their statement, you're redefining it. That's power. This technique is called reframing, and it's used constantly by high-level communicators. Top lawyers don't argue facts directly, they reshape how the jury interprets them. Politicians don't answer hard questions. They redirect the meaning behind them. Negotiators don't fight objections, they reposition them. They don't attack the argument, they shift the lens through which the argument is viewed. And once the lens changes, the outcome changes. If you control the frame, you control the narrative. If you control the narrative, you control perception. And if you control perception, you control the result. Here's something most people completely underestimate. The calmer person appears more correct, even if they're not. In the middle of an argument, people aren't just listening to words, they're reading emotional stability. When someone raises their voice, speaks faster, interrupts, or reacts defensively, they may feel justified, but they look unstable, and perception matters. On the other hand, when someone stays composed, steady tone, controlled breathing, relaxed posture, they look rational, grounded, in control. Your nervous system becomes your weapon. Slow your breathing intentionally. Lower your voice instead of raising it. Pause for 2 seconds before responding. That pause is powerful. Silence makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people fill silence by talking, usually too much. When someone keeps explaining, defending, or emotionally escalating, they start revealing insecurity. The more emotional someone becomes, the less persuasive they appear. Not because emotions are bad, but because emotional loss of control signals weakness in a power dynamic. Calmness, on the other hand, signals confidence, authority, self-assurance. It communicates, "I'm not threatened." And humans instinctively respect the person who looks least threatened. This doesn't mean you suppress emotions. It means you manage them. Because in arguments, emotional regulation is dominance. When you refuse to match someone's intensity, when you stay centered while they spiral, you shift the power balance instantly, and often without saying much at all. You win. This is where things get advanced. Most people think winning an argument means talking more, explaining better, defending harder. But the real power move? Stop defending. Start asking questions. Instead of saying, "That's not true," say, "What makes you see it that way?" Now the pressure shifts. They have to explain. They have to justify. They have to organize their thoughts. And here's the reality. Most people don't deeply analyze their beliefs. They repeat opinions they've absorbed from social media, friends, past experiences, emotions. When you calmly ask them to break down their reasoning, cracks start to show. Not because you attacked them, but because you made them think. And thinking under pressure exposes weak logic. Questions create space. Questions slow momentum. Questions force clarity. Meanwhile, you stay composed. The best debaters don't overpower conversations. They guide them. They let the other person talk long enough to reveal contradictions, exaggerations, or emotional bias. And once that happens, you don't need to destroy their argument. It weakens itself. When you ask instead of defend, you stop reacting and start leading. This one surprises people. If you want to win an argument, sometimes you agree, but you do it strategically. Instead of pushing back on everything, you say, "You're right about that part. I can see why you'd feel that way. That makes sense from your perspective." And watch what happens. Their defenses drop. Why? Because resistance fuels resistance. When someone feels opposed, they double down. They talk louder. They argue harder. But when you acknowledge part of their point, even a small part, the tension softens. Agreement creates psychological safety. And once someone feels heard, they stop fighting to be heard. That's when you introduce your perspective. Calmly, gradually, not as an attack, but as an addition. Here's the part I see differently. Now it feels collaborative, not confrontational. Agreement lowers conflict, and lower conflict increases influence. You don't win by overpowering someone. You win by reducing friction so your ideas can actually land. Strength isn't always force. Sometimes it's flexibility. And strategic agreement is controlled flexibility. That's how you shift arguments without escalating them. Here's another powerful shift most people overlook. Move the argument from me versus you to us versus the problem. The second an argument feels like a battle, ego takes over. Now it's about winning, proving, dominating. But the moment you change the language, you change the energy. Instead of saying, you're wrong, say, I think we both want this to work. I know we're on the same team here. Let's figure this out. Notice the shift. Now it's collaboration, not competition. Humans are wired to resist opponents, but we naturally cooperate with allies. When someone feels like you're attacking them, they defend themselves. When someone feels like you're standing beside them, they open up. Creating alignment lowers ego and increases problem solving. And here's the key. The moment you create shared goals, you gain leverage. Because now, if they keep fighting, they look unreasonable. You're offering teamwork. If they reject that, the contrast becomes obvious. That's influence without aggression. You don't escalate, you align. And alignment quietly gives you control of the direction. Here's the ultimate power move. Walking away, not storming out, not slamming doors, not giving attitude, but calmly disengaging. Because the person who needs the argument less holds more power. Most arguments escalate because both people are chasing something, validation, control, the last word. And when you refuse to chase it, you shift the balance instantly. Instead of fighting to be understood, you say, I don't think this conversation is productive right now. Let's revisit it later. Calm, neutral, unbothered, no sarcasm, no emotional edge, just composure. This does two powerful things. First, it shows emotional control. You're signaling that you're not overwhelmed, not reactive, not desperate to win. Second, it denies the other person the emotional reaction they may be feeding on. Some arguments survive on energy, frustration, defensiveness, anger. When you remove that energy, the argument has nothing to consume. And here's what's interesting. The person who keeps pushing after you disengage often ends up looking unreasonable because you offered space, you offered calm, you refused chaos. Walking away isn't weakness. It's strategic detachment. It says, my peace is more valuable than this moment. And that mindset, that's real dominance. Because true power isn't about winning every argument. It's about knowing when the argument isn't worth your power at all. Let me be clear about something. Winning every argument isn't about being deceptive. It's not about twisting facts. It's not about manipulating people. It's about understanding human psychology. Because arguments are rarely intellectual battles. They're emotional negotiations. They're subtle power exchanges. They're moments where identity, ego, and insecurity quietly step into the room. But here's the deeper truth most people never realize. The most powerful person in the room doesn't need to win every argument. Read that again. Real confidence doesn't fight for validation. It doesn't scramble to defend every criticism. It doesn't panic when challenged. It evaluates. It decides. It chooses which battles deserve energy and which ones deserve silence. When you master framing, you control direction. When you master emotional control, you control perception. When you use strategic agreement, you reduce resistance. When you exit calmly, you protect your power. At that point, you're not arguing to win. You're communicating from strength. And that changes everything. Because once you stop needing the last word, you start having the strongest presence. Once you stop reacting impulsively, people start measuring their tone around you. Once you stop chasing validation, you become harder to shake. And ironically, that's when you rarely lose. Not because you dominate, but because you operate above the chaos. Eventually, something interesting happens. You don't feel the urge to win anymore. You feel the urge to understand, to align, to lead conversations instead of surviving them. And that's real power. If this resonated with you, subscribe for more psychology-backed insights on power, confidence, and human behavior. And I want to hear from you. What's the hardest argument you've ever had to navigate? Was it at work, in a relationship, with family? Drop it in the comments. Let's talk about it.